Mighty Companion. Well, here we are. We're getting ready to do Lesson 70 in A Course in Miracles. And I'm Earl Purdy. And today's lesson is My Salvation Comes From Me. And the Course defines salvation as peace. It defines salvation as right-mindedness. It defines salvation as forgiveness. So these are all words you can use to make the term salvation more meaningful to you. I personally love the term peace and right-mindedness. So my peace comes from me. So you could just say my peace comes from me. My salvation comes from me is the same as saying my peace comes from me. So let's go through it. Our temptation is nothing more than some form of the basic temptation not to believe that your peace comes from you, which is the idea for today. Salvation, which is peace, seems to come from everywhere except from you. The Course also defines salvation as sinlessness, guiltlessness, which is innocence. So my innocence comes from me. There's nothing more important in A Course in Miracles than the recognition of your innocence. So I'm going to also say innocence because that is so powerful, because an innocent mind doesn't believe that it deserves to suffer, and so it doesn't attract suffering to it. So innocence seems to come from everywhere except from you. So too does the source of guilt. You see neither guilt nor innocence as in your own mind and nowhere else. When you realize that all guilt is solely an invention of your mind, you also realize that guilt and innocence, which is salvation, must be in the same place. And understanding that guilt and innocence are in the same place, you are saved. Now, the seeming cost of accepting today's idea that your peace, your innocence, and your salvation comes from you, the cost of accepting that idea is it means that nothing outside yourself can save you, nothing outside yourself can give you peace. It also means that nothing outside yourself can hurt you, nothing outside yourself can disturb your peace or upset you in any way. Today's idea, my salvation comes from me, my peace comes from me, my innocence comes from me, that thought places you in charge of the universe where you belong because of what you are. This is not a role that can be partially accepted. And you must surely begin to see that accepting this idea that your peace comes from you and your innocence comes from you is salvation, is healing, is right-mindedness. It may not, however, be clear to you why the recognition that guilt is in your own mind entails the realization that innocence is in your own mind as well. God would not have put the remedy for the sickness where the remedy can't help. That's the way your mind has worked, but hardly your Creator's. Your Creator wants you to be healed. So your Creator has kept the source of healing where the need for healing lies, in the mind. You have tried to do just the opposite. That means making every attempt, however distorted and fantastic it might be, to separate healing from the sickness for which the healing was intended, and thus keep the sickness or the problem or the upset. Your purpose was to ensure that healing did not occur. God's purpose was to ensure that healing did occur. Today, we practice realizing that God's will and ours are really the same in this. In other words, God wants us to be healed and happy, and we do not really want to be sick and unhappy, because sickness, upset, fear, it makes us unhappy. Therefore, in accepting the idea for today, my salvation comes from me, my peace comes from me, my happiness comes from me, when we say that, we are really in agreement with God. Our Creator does not want us to be sick and fearful and unhappy, neither do we. Our Creator wants us to be healed. So do we. We are ready for 2 longer practice periods today, each of which should last some 10 or 15 minutes. We will, however, still let you decide when to undertake the practice periods. We will follow this practice for a number of lessons, and it would again be well to decide in advance when would be a good time to lay aside for each of these practice periods, and then adhering to your own decisions as closely as possible. Begin these practice periods by repeating the idea for today, my salvation comes from me. That's the same as saying my innocence comes from me, my peace comes from me. Adding a statement signifying your recognition that salvation comes from nothing outside of you. You might put it this way. My salvation comes from me, it cannot come from anywhere else. My peace comes from me, it cannot come from anywhere else. Then devote a few minutes, with your eyes closed, to reviewing some of the external places where you have looked for happiness in the past, in other people, in possessions, in various situations and events, and in self-concepts that you sought to make real. Recognize that your happiness is not there. It's not in other people. Your happiness and peace and innocence is not in possessions. It's not in various situations and events and in self-concepts that you have sought to make real. Tell yourself, my salvation, my happiness, my peace cannot come from any of these things. My happiness, my salvation, my peace cannot come from any of these things. My salvation, my happiness, and my peace comes from me, and only from me. Now, we will try again to reach the light, the truth, the love in you, which is where your salvation, healing, and happiness is. You cannot find your happiness and healing in the clouds of guilt that surround the light of innocence. It is in them you have been looking for it. It is not in the guilt. Your happiness and peace is past the clouds of guilt and fear, and in the light and love of innocence beyond. Remember that you will have to go through the clouds before you can reach the light. But remember also that you have never found anything in the cloud patterns you imagined that endured or that you wanted. Since all illusions of salvation, since all false ideas of peace have failed you, surely you do not want to remain in the clouds of fear, looking vainly for idols there, when you could so easily walk into the light of real peace, real right-mindedness, real salvation. Try to pass the clouds of guilt and fear by whatever means appeals to you. If it helps you, think of me holding your hand and leading you if it helps you. And I assure you this will be no idle fantasy. For the short and frequent practice periods today, remind yourself that your salvation, your peace, your innocence comes from you, and nothing but your own thoughts. Nothing but your own thoughts. Nothing but your own thoughts can hamper your progress. You are free from all external interference. You are free from all external interference. You are in charge of your innocence. You are in charge of your salvation. You are in charge of your happiness. You are in charge of your peace. You are in charge of your right-mindedness. You are in charge of the peace and the innocence and the right-mindedness of the world. Say then, my salvation comes from me. My peace comes from me. My innocence comes from me. My happiness comes from me. Nothing outside of me can hold me back. Nothing outside of you can hold you back. Within me is the world's salvation and healing and my own. Within you is the world's salvation and healing and your own. So the lesson for today is my salvation comes from me. That's the same as saying my peace comes from me. My innocence comes from me. My happiness comes from me. My salvation comes from me. My innocence comes from me. My happiness comes from me. My peace comes from me. My peace comes from me. Your peace comes from you. Your peace comes from you. Your salvation comes from you. Your salvation comes from you. Your salvation comes from you. Your peace comes from you. Your right-mindedness comes from you. Your innocence comes from you. Your happiness comes from you. It comes from you. My salvation comes from me. Your salvation comes from you. My happiness comes from me. Your salvation comes from you. My happiness comes from me. My happiness comes from me. My salvation 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 comes from me. Your salvation comes from you. Your salvation comes from you. Your peace comes from you. Your innocence comes from you. My salvation comes from me. That's your Course in Miracles lesson for today. Pass this video along, forward it to other people, and recognize that, hey, you are not alone. You should check out my website at earlpurdy.com and let peace extend from my mind and my heart to yours.